if you lose your job tomorrow, your financial security takes an obvious hit, right? Like that's a given.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But for a surprising number of people, a professional setback actually triggers this complete and utter psychological collapse.
Right, because it's not just the money.
Exactly. It isn't just about the paycheck. It's a total loss of self.
Mm.
And according to the research we're looking at today, that devastation happens because they made the incredibly dangerous mistake of building only one version of themselves.
Which is, a vulnerability we are culturally encouraged to develop. I mean, we're told to pick a lane, focus, and become just one defined thing.
Yeah, totally.
But that one's entirely counter to how our minds actually work.
I mean, think about your own life for a second.
Yeah.
That you sitting in a highly structured, serious, professional meeting posture straight, using all that industry jargon, operates with a completely different rhythm than the you laughing at a loud family gathering.
Yeah, different entirely.
And that person is entirely different from the you who spends Sunday mornings like covered in dirt gardening or geeking out over a highly specific weekend hobby. It's almost like you're an actor seamlessly transitioning between different roles.
And a lot of people notice that shift and feel this sense of guilt or inauthenticity, like they're wearing a mask in one of those scenarios.
Right, they're being fake.
Exactly. They label it as code switching. But code switching is a tactical maneuver. It's consciously or unconsciously adjusting your behavior, tone, or language to fit a social environment, often to, protect yourself or blend in. What we're exploring today goes significantly deeper than adjusting a behavioral mask.
Which brings us to today's source material. We're diving into this fascinating piece from Psychology Today titled, "You Don't Have to Choose Just One Version of Yourself."
Such a good piece.
It really is. It's authored by Dr. Elizabeth Mateer, who is a neuropsychology fellow at Harvard Medical School. And she argues that having multiple, seemingly unrelated identities isn't a sign that you're unfocused, scattered, or faking your way through life. It's actually the ultimate psychological scaffolding for a resilient, creative brain. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because the distinction between putting on a tactical mask and genuinely having multiple identities is a pretty heavy concept to start with.
It really requires a paradigm shift in how we view the self. I mean, you aren't just a singular entity acting like a parent and then acting like a professional and then acting like a musician. You genuinely are all of those different people.
Wait, literally?
Literally. The human brain is not a singular fixed monolith. We are naturally plural. These different versions of you are merged dynamically based on the context you find yourself in.
Which completely challenges that whole idea of faking it.
Yeah.
If I'm using a different vocabulary and like a different energy level with my kids than I do with my boss, I'm not being deceptive.
No, not at all.
I'm just booting up a different part of the exact same operating system.
Yeah.
But why does the brain actually need us to partition ourselves like this? I mean, why didn't we just evolve to have one baseline personality that reacts identically to everything?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at how personality psychology understands the architecture of the mind. Humans naturally organize their identities into what researchers call self-aspect.
Okay, self-aspect.
Yeah, you can think of a self-aspect as a distinct domain of your life. So a specific role, a deep relationship, or a core interest. And the critical finding here is that how you organize and maintain these self-aspects has a direct, measurable impact on your baseline mental health.
Wow.
Dr. Mateer actually grounds her argument in Patricia Linville's social cognitive model of self-complexity.
I want to break down that term, self-complexity. What does a highly complex self actually look like in practice?
So Linville's model proposes that an individual with a high level of self-complexity has a large number of distinct, meaningful self-aspects that don't heavily overlap.
Okay, meaning they aren't all tied to the same thing.
Exactly. They might be a dedicated marketing director, but they're also deeply invested in being a sibling, an amateur competitive cyclist, and a community volunteer. The psychological mechanism here is that this complexity acts as a cognitive buffer against stress.
The logic behind that buffering mechanism is, well, it's incredibly intuitive when you look at it structurally. It's basically a matter of load distribution.
Yes, perfect way to put it.
Right. If your entire sense of self is consolidated into one single role, let's say your career, and you fail at a major project, you don't just experience a professional setback.
No, the failure is absolute.
Yeah, your entire world crumbles because your world was entirely contained within that one domain.
That is the architectural flaw of the narrow identity. You have no shock absorbers. But with high self-complexity, that same professional failure is contained.
Right.
I mean, it hurts, certainly, but the other domains of your life, the cyclist, the sibling, the volunteer, they remain completely intact. They provide a stable psychological grounding while you navigate the crisis in the professional domain.
Structurally, it's the difference between being a unicycle and being a multi-legged table.
Oh, I like that.
Like if you're a unicycle defined by that one single wheel, a flat tire means you're instantly face-planting into the concrete. Your function's just gone.
Completely gone. Yeah.
But if you're a multi-legged table, your weight is distributed. If a crisis comes along and kicks the career leg out from under you, the table might wobble, sure, but it doesn't collapse.
Yeah.
You've built-in structural support holding you upright.
What's fascinating here is how directly this structural reality contradicts the prevailing cultural narrative.
Yeah, totally.
We're constantly warned that taking on multiple diverse roles means you're going to be spread too thin. We equate multifaceted lives with inevitable burnout.
We treat identity like a limited battery. If you plug too many things into it, the whole system just shorts out.
That is the assumption, right? But Dr. Mateer brings in a foundational piece of sociological research to disprove that.
Oh, the 1983 study.
Yeah, in 1983, sociologist Peggy Thoits tested what she called the identity accumulation hypothesis. She analyzed community survey data to observe the actual psychological outcomes of people holding multiple social identities. And the data showed that holding more social identities strongly correlates with lower psychological distress.
Meaning lower rates of anxiety and depression simply by occupying more distinct roles.
Precisely. Because these social identities aren't merely drains on our cognitive battery, they are frameworks for meaning. They provide a structure for our behavior and expectations.
Wow.
Holding multiple aspects of your identity doesn't fragment your mind. It builds that protective psychological scaffolding you described with the table analogy.
So the data is basically flashing a giant warning sign, telling us that cognitive diversification is a survival strategy.
Absolutely it is.
Just like a financial portfolio, if you aren't diversifying your identity, you're dangerously over-leveraged in one area of your life, which, naturally leads to the next question. If this is so demonstrably good for us, why is the pressure to specialize so intense? Why do we feel compelled to introduce ourselves with our job title and literally nothing else?
Well, the pressure primarily stems from economic incentives. Professional environments and modern markets heavily reward hyperspecialization.
Oh, for sure.
We've built an economy that wants you to be the absolute best at one incredibly narrow task because that's what is easiest to monetize.
And beyond the economics, it's just cognitive ease for the people around us. Singular labels are easier to digest. Like, we love the archetype of the obsessive genius.
Right, the person who does nothing else.
We want the doctor who literally lives in the hospital, or the artist who suffers in absolute isolation for their craft. Nuance is messy.
It is messy, but real lives naturally evolve and accumulate complexity. Dr. Mateer actually shares a very revealing personal anecdote in the article about the internal friction this causes.
Oh, I love this part.
Yeah, before she committed to clinical psychology and brain science, she was deeply immersed in studying English literature and creative writing, specifically poetry.
Right.
Poetry was her primary mechanism for making sense of the world. But as she transitioned into the highly empirical world of neuropsychology, she felt an intense pressure to completely bury that artistic identity.
She felt it would make her look, quote-unquote, less serious in the lab. And that is such a universal fear. We assume that revealing a contrasting identity automatically dilutes our credibility in our primary field.
It's the fear of being perceived as a dabbler. But the breakthrough for her came when she realized that poetry and psychology were not competing for space in her brain. They were simply two different lenses focused on the exact same target, understanding the human experience.
One relies on data, the other on emotion.
Yes, one lens relies on empirical data, research, and observable behavior. The other relies on emotion, language, and metaphor.
See, I'm struggling with the math on this, though, and I think a lot of people hearing this are going to hit the same mental roadblock.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I only have 24 hours in a day, and I'm splitting my limited time between trying to make partner at a law firm and taking dedicated pottery classes, I am mathematically giving fewer hours to my career. Doesn't this identity stacking inevitably dilute your primary goal? I mean, isn't there a real danger of becoming a jack of all trades, but a master of none?
It's the most common pushback, but it's based on a flawed premise regarding how human cognition actually works. It assumes that your energy and your intellectual capacity operate on a strict, linear progression,
Like a machine.
like a factory assembly line where more hours blindly equal a better product. But cognitive research shows that human attention suffers from diminishing returns. Your 10th consecutive hour agonizing over a legal brief is not going to yield the same insight as your first hour.
Right, you're just staring at the screen at that point.
Exactly. In fact, that 10th hour might be vastly more productive if it's spent doing pottery.
Because it forces the brain into a different state.
Exactly. And this transitions us from the defensive benefits of multiple identities, the buffering against stress, to the highly offensive benefits. This is where we look at the actual engine of human creativity.
Okay, I'm with you.
Breakthrough thinking rarely happens in a vacuum of intense specialization. It occurs when the brain is forced to connect information across seemingly totally unrelated domains.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It really does. Dr. Mateer highlights recent neuroimaging research focused on a phenomenon called cross-domain analogical reasoning.
Let's break down what is physically happening inside the brain when someone engages in that. Cross-domain analogical reasoning sounds like a massive mouthful, but what is the actual mechanism at play?
So when you learn a new skill or dive into a specific domain, your brain builds and reinforces a specific neural pathway. You get very efficient at thinking within that closed loop. But cross-domain analogical reasoning is the brain's ability to essentially build a physical bridge between two completely isolated neural pathways. The neuroimaging shows that engaging in vastly different pursuits actually thickens the white matter tracks that allow different regions of your brain to communicate.
Wait, physically thickens them.
Yes, physically. It literally links brain network connectivity to individual creativity.
So you aren't just memorizing more facts, you're
Yeah.
structurally upgrading the hardware. You're expanding the database your brain can query when it runs into a problem.
Precisely. And while the Steve Jobs calligraphy story is a well-known trope at this point, it is the perfect practical illustration of this neurobiology in action.
Right, to take in a random class.
He drops in on a college calligraphy class simply out of artistic curiosity. It had zero logical application to the nascent world of computer engineering.
But a decade later, when they're designing the Macintosh, that isolated neural pathway for artistic proportion and typography connects with the engineering pathway. If he had only been the tech guy, perfectly specialized and focused, the personal computer might have been stuck with blocky, utilitarian text for another generation.
That cross-domain bridge changed the entire aesthetic standard of an industry. And we see this everywhere. A scientific background brings rigorous analytical precision to an artistic endeavor. Conversely, a creative background allows a scientist to communicate incredibly dense concepts with clarity, or, approach a laboratory failure from a completely lateral angle.
It really changes the way we should view our own weird combinations of hobbies and skills. Instead of viewing your weekend pursuits as distractions from your real work, you should view them as cognitive cross-training.
Oh, cognitive cross-training, that's good.
Think about professional runners. They don't just run on a track all day, they spend hours in the swimming pool. Swimming doesn't look anything like running, but it forces the body to build different muscle groups. It massively
Different systems.
Ultimately, the time spent in the water makes them vastly faster and more durable when they get back on the track. In the exact same way, poetry builds the lateral thinking capacity that makes a neuropsychologist more effective in the lab.
The cross-training analogy perfectly captures the concept of agility. And that brings us to how modern psychology defines true, sustainable resilience. This ties heavily into an evidence-based framework known as acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
Let's define ACT for a second, because it's often reduced to just being about mindfulness, but the mechanics of it are much more robust than that.
Much more, yeah. A core pillar of ACT is a concept called psychological flexibility. It's the ability to stay in contact with the present moment and adapt your behavior based on what the situation demands, rather than rigidly adhering to a script.
Okay.
Researchers find that individuals who are psychologically flexible, meaning they fluidly adapt across their different roles, report significantly lower levels of distress during hard times compared to people with very narrow self-concepts.
Because the person with a rigid self-concept is practicing something called cognitive fusion. Right. They're entirely fused to the idea of, I'm a lawyer, I must always be analytical, competitive, and unyielding.
Yes, and that lack of cognitive flexibility makes them incredibly fragile. Cognitive flexibility is the brain's ability to shift perspectives, update outdated beliefs when presented with new evidence, and integrate novel, even painful experiences into a coherent sense of self.
So they can actually roll with the punches.
Right. If you're entirely fused to one narrow identity, a failure requires you to deny reality to protect your ego or completely shatter. But a cognitively flexible person can say, this specific domain of my life is currently failing, but I possess other operational modes and resources I can pivot to.
So what does this all mean? Because we have to fundamentally redefine resilience. Culturally, we tend to picture resilience as just gritting your teeth, clenching your jaw, and enduring a storm without moving an inch, just standing there and taking the punch.
Which is an incredibly brittle way to move through life.
It's exhausting. And the research suggests that true resilience is the exact opposite of standing still. It's the ability to adapt, to shift your weight, to integrate a hardship, and to keep moving forward without letting a single negative outcome define your entire existence.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it validates that all those different parts of yourself, the professional, the creative, the relational, the absurd hobbyist, are not competing for a finite amount of airtime. They're a deep, interconnected well of resources that you're supposed to draw from depending on what the day demands.
This makes me think about the metaphors we use for strength. A rigid identity is like a pane of glass. It looks incredibly clear, sharp, and solid. But if you hit it with enough blunt force, the entire structure shatters into 1,000 useless pieces.
Yeah, there's no give.
A flexible, multifaceted identity is more like a Swiss Army knife. When life hands you a screw, you don't panic or shatter because you're usually using the knife blade. You just calmly fold out the screwdriver. You adapt to the problem by accessing a different part of yourself.
And crucially, you recognize that the knife and the screwdriver are housed in the exact same tool. They're integrated. You don't have to pretend the knife doesn't exist just because you're currently turning a screw.
So giving yourself permission to be a messy, beautifully complicated Venn diagram of roles and interests isn't a lack of focus. It's not a symptom of being indecisive. It is the literal neurological secret to building a highly resilient mind and a powerfully creative brain. You don't have to choose just one version of yourself because every single version serves a structural purpose.
This raises an important question, though. A thought to perhaps leave everyone chewing on.
Okay.
We spent this entire time exploring how these different identities support and enrich each other, how the poet aids the scientist, how the swimmer aids the runner. But what happens when two of your deeply held identities fundamentally clash on a major life decision?
Like an internal civil war.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where the parent in you demands absolute safety, predictability, and stability, but the entrepreneur in you demands taking a massive, highly calculated financial risk to build a legacy. They are both genuine parts of your identity, but their goals are completely mutually exclusive in that moment.
Wow, yeah.
Who is the internal director that breaks that tie? Are we ultimately just the sum of these competing roles, fighting for dominance? Or is there a quieter, deeper awareness sitting in the space between them, calmly deciding who gets the microphone today?
That is a profound question to walk away with. Who holds the gavel when your identities take each other to court? Thank you all for joining us on this exploration today. We hope this deep dive gave you the structural evidence you need to embrace every single room you walk into and every version of yourself that walks in with you. Keep building out those multiple identities, keep diversifying that cognitive portfolio, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.